Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Curtis. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Economics Department to this spring lecture on inequality, discrimination, and opportunity. I would like to extend a special welcome to my students and those of Professor Ramos Toro in our Principles of Economics classes this term, who are just beginning their study in the discipline. This lecture series grew out of the Economics Department's commitments to racial justice articulated in June of 2020. The primary purpose of these events is to deepen Dartmouth students' understanding of the role of inequality, discrimination, and opportunity in society and how economics can increase our understanding of these phenomena and inform policy responses. Our event today is co-sponsored with the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center of the Schoolhouse Anti-Racism Experience, the Dartmouth Institute, and the Sadie Alexander Association. The format for this afternoon will consist of a 45-minute lecture followed by some time for Q&A. I would like now to turn the microphone over to Francine Kaluri from the Sadie Alexander Association, who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Francina Kaluri. I'm a sophomore here, majoring in economics at Dartmouth. In addition to this, I serve on the Executive Council for the Sadie Alexander Association as a member at large. This is a group that works in close collaboration with students from underrepresented minority backgrounds, first-gen students, and the Dartmouth econ faculty to achieve the mission of expanding the diversity and inclusivity of our department. For example, the Lido seminar, as Professor Curtis mentioned, originated as a joint effort between SAA and the econ department to progress in this shared goal. On behalf of the Sadie Alexander Association at Dartmouth and the department, I am honored to have the opportunity to today welcome Professor Raj Chetty. Professor Chetty received his PhD from Harvard University. Today, he serves as the William A. Ackman Professor of Economics at Harvard University and is one of the youngest tenured professors in the institution's history. Professor Chetty is also the Director of Opportunity Insights, which is an organization that uses big data to formulate insights on how to expand opportunities of economic success for children from disadvantaged backgrounds and translate these ideas into policy change. In alignment with this goal, Professor Chetty's research is also informed by his interests in economic and social mobility. He works to spearhead the need for empirical evidence coupled with economic theory to help drive policy design and decision-making that empowers individuals to rise out of poverty and achieve better life outcomes. His work on topics ranging from tax policy and unemployment insurance to education and affordable housing has been widely cited in academia, media outlets, and congressional testimony. Throughout his career, Professor Chetty has made remarkable contributions to the field of economics and beyond. In recognition of this, he has received numerous awards for his research, including a MacArthur Genius Fellowship and the John Bates Clark Medal. Professor Chetty and his insights into upward mobility, social inequality, public policy, and their combinations with quantitative methods has served as a point of personal inspiration for me, as has done for, I'm certain, many students and faculty here today. With this, I would like to begin by thanking Professor Chetty for his willingness and time to join with us today. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Raj Chetty.
Thanks so much for the very warm introduction. Is this on? Can folks hear me okay? And thank you all for being here. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here at Dartmouth. I've not had a personal connection to Dartmouth, but I'm very fond of the department for multiple reasons. Both my niece and nephew actually went to Dartmouth College, studied economics here, and had a terrific time that they're always telling me about. And at a more personal level, I've been greatly influenced by economists at Dartmouth. So in particular, Doug Steger and John Skinner, who are sitting right here, both were visiting Harvard about 10, 12 years ago. when we started to get access to some of the data that I'm going to describe in this talk today, longitudinal data from tax records covering the entire US population. And I distinctly remember a series of conversations with both of them that I really see as shaping the agenda we ended up choosing to pursue. Doug, for instance, telling me, have you heard about the Tennessee Star experiment, which is an early experiment in class size that we ended up studying and provided the foundation for many things we've been thinking about. So it's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk with all of you. So I'm going to talk today about how we can make changes in our own communities, in institutions like right here at Dartmouth, in expanding economic opportunity. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is of course a multifaceted, complex concept that can mean different things to different people. But I want to distill it in this first chart here to one key aspect of the American dream, which I think is central to the American identity, certainly something that drew my own parents to come to this country. The idea that we at least aspire to be a country where through hard work, any child can go on to have a higher standard of living than their parents did. And so in a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration by measuring the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s, and adjusting for inflation. And we're starting out in this first chart here by looking at that data by the year in which the child was born, starting all the way on the far left with kids born in 1940, and then at the far right looking at kids born in the middle of the 1980s who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults. So if you look at this chart, you can see that for kids born in the middle of the last century, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up relative to your parents. By our estimation, 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the middle of the 1980s, it's now become essentially a 50-50 shot, a coin flip, as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream. So this broad trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the American economy that we'd like to understand. But I would argue that it's also of fundamental social and political interest because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, and that's been reflected in recent electoral outcomes and so forth. And so motivated by this trend, in our research group at Harvard, Opportunity Insights, we're focused on the very big picture question of how we can restore the American dream, what's driving the fading American dream that we saw in the previous slide, and how can we, going forward, understand the science of economic opportunity, if you will, to make changes that might increase children's chances of rising up from all backgrounds going forward. Now, we are, of course, by no means the first group to be thinking about this set of questions. There's an enormous literature in the social sciences, in economics and sociology and many other fields, thinking about the determinants of inequality and social mobility. Our angle on it is to make use of large-scale longitudinal administrative data, big data, to use the Silicon Valley buzzword, to try to make further progress on these questions. So much as like the students here, you hear all the time about companies like Google and Amazon using large-scale data to improve the products they offer. Increasingly, I think many of us have the vision in social science that large-scale data can give us a much more precise understanding of important economic and social policy questions. In this case, what are the determinants of economic mobility and economic opportunity? So what I'm going to show you today is how we can study the determinants of economic opportunity in a much more precise way than was previously feasible by disaggregating that national picture that I started out with to look at variation across different areas, different subgroups, by race, by ethnicity, by gender, and use various quasi-experimental methods to start to uncover the mechanisms that are underlying differences in economic opportunity. So what I'll do in particular in the next half hour, 45 minutes or so, is present an overview of a series of papers with many different collaborators, John Friedman, Nathan Hendren, Matt Jackson, Larry Katz, Johannes Strobel, Teresa Kukler, and many others who I'll cite along the way. And I'll start out with the first paper where we disaggregate that national picture geographically by turning to this map here, which shows you the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So let me first start by describing how we construct this map, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we do here is take data on 20 million children, essentially all children born in the United States in the early 1980s, and get information on them from anonymized tax returns, which we link to their parents' information and map back to where they grew up. Okay, so using that data set where we have information on parents' incomes, kids' incomes, where kids grew up, and so on, we divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we calculate a very simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, what is the average income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families? And we define low-income families as families at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which corresponds to a household income of about $27,000 per year. So to think of this in simple terms, imagine you take a set of kids who are growing up in a family making $27,000 a year in all these different places in America, follow them over time, and measure how much money they themselves are making as adults when they're 35 years old, as measured by their tax filings. So to take an example, if you look at Boston, the kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, one generation later, on average, they're making $36,800 according to the tax records. So we color the map here so that red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility, where kids are less likely to rise up and achieve the American dream. And blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility. If you start by looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this map, you can see that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up, even in present-day America for kids born in the 1980s. In some places, like in rural Iowa, kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year, one generation later are making $45,000 or even $50,000 a year on average. So that's a substantial amount of upward mobility in a single generation. But on the other hand, you have places like Charlotte, North Carolina, and much of the Southeast, where kids starting out in families at that exact same income level are one generation later actually making less than their parents were on average. If you look at Charlotte at $26,300. Which is remarkable if you think about it, given the amount of economic progress that's occurred in the US over the past 30 years, and in Charlotte in particular. So, motivated by this map, I think there are two interesting questions that emerge. One, from a social science perspective, this map, in a sense, gives us a new lens to understand the determinants of economic opportunity, being able to disaggregate that national picture that I started out with in this much finer way allows us to ask questions like, what's different about Iowa versus the Southeast versus Cincinnati versus Salt Lake City? What can we learn about the determinants of economic opportunity from those kinds of comparisons? And second, I think the reason those scientific questions are of interest is they might point the way towards potential policy changes that we could make to increase economic opportunity in places like Charlotte going forward, try to replicate some of the successes in other parts of the country. So motivated by that reasoning, what I'm going to do in this talk is basically lay out a series of potential hypotheses or explanations for the variation in this map. You might already have some in your mind for what might be driving this variation. And I'm just going to talk about a series of papers we've written where we systematically try to test what is it that's driving these differences. After then developing a knowledge base about the science underlying this, we're going to talk about how one might be able to take that research and translate it to impacts on policy, to potential policy changes that we can make going forward to increase economic opportunity. So let me start with the first hypothesis that economists often think of. Maybe this is about differences in the types of jobs that are available in different areas, differences in labor markets. So to take one example, Silicon Valley, we all know that the Bay Area has been booming with the tech sector in the past 30 years. And maybe that kind of thing is the reason you have higher levels of upward mobility in some places relative to others. So to assess that, let's turn to this plot here, where I'm going to take the data on upward mobility that I just showed you on the map before for the 30 largest cities in America, and plot it against job growth rates from 1990 to 2010, the period over which the kids in this sample were growing up. So a simple measure of how rapidly each of these cities is growing. So what you can see here is that there's basically no relationship between these two variables. In particular, you have cities like Charlotte and Atlanta, which by this measure and pretty much any other standard measure that you look at are some of the most rapidly growing cities in America. You don't even really need to look at data to figure that out. If you were to drive around Charlotte today versus 25 years ago, it would be obvious that the city is dramatically different, much richer now than it was 25 years ago. Yet, as you can see here, when we look at the longitudinal data where we're following kids who grew up in Charlotte over time, you can see that Charlotte actually ranks the lowest among large American cities in terms of rates of upward mobility for kids who grew up there. So you might first ask, how is that even possible arithmetically? That if you look at repeated snapshots of data, it looks like this place is getting richer over time. But if I look at a given set of kids who are growing up in this place, they're not actually doing better. So the way I think about it is that Charlotte and Atlanta basically import talent. Lots of people move to places like Charlotte to get high-paying jobs at a firm like Bank of America, which is headquartered in Charlotte. But what we're seeing in these new data where we're able to track people over time is that apparently those benefits don't flow directly to the kids growing up in Charlotte themselves, particularly the kids growing up in low-income families. So that simple negative result, I think, immediately has some interesting implications. It means that just trying to get the Amazon headquarters, for example, to be located in your city is not in and of itself the solution to creating more economic opportunity. You actually need to take a more deliberate approach, perhaps, to equipping people with the skills, what economists would call human capital development, giving them the skills needed to get those high-paying jobs. It's not enough to just have a strong labor market. Okay, so that was the first potential explanation. Maybe it's about differences in jobs. It doesn't look like that's the answer. So let's go back to the big map here and consider a second possibility. Maybe, this time not from economics, but from demography. So anyone familiar with the demographic structure of the US would recognize that there's a potential connection to race here. In particular, the red and orange colored parts of the map tend to be the places with larger African American populations, the Southeast, cities in the industrial Midwest, like Cleveland and Detroit, and so on. Now, we all know that there's a long history of racial disparities in America, and so you might wonder how much of the differences that we're seeing in this map are really about differences by race rather than differences by place. So to get at that, what we did next is took the information from the tax records, which don't themselves give you information on people's race and ethnicity, and we linked that data to data from the census, which gives us information on race and ethnicity for everyone in the US population. That allows us to construct this pair of maps here, the same statistics that I've been showing you on upward mobility, but separately now for black men on the left and white men on the right. Now, when you look at these two maps, initially sometimes people react by saying, oh, you've put these maps on two different color scales, right? Like a red-orange color scale on the left and a blue-green color scale on the right. But in fact, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see that we have not done that. The maps are on exactly the same color scale. It's just that there's such an extreme difference in rates of upward mobility between black and white men in America that it's almost like you're living in two different countries. To put it in a little bit more precise terms from a statistical point of view, what you have here are basically two non-overlapping distributions. The very best places for upward mobility for black men, a place like Boston, for example, where a black man growing up in a low-income family can expect to earn, on average, about $25,000 a year. Those places have worse opportunities than the very worst places for upward mobility for white men, a place like Charlotte, North Carolina. So what these data show is that it's unmistakable that race remains incredibly important in America, and importantly, conditional on class. So remember that we're using very precise information from tax returns to look at kids who are growing up in families at the exact same income level, and even conditional on that, there are enormously different prospects for black men versus white men. So now you'll notice when I started talking about the importance of race, I also began to cut the data by gender, focusing specifically on men. Why did I do that? If you now construct the exact same pair of maps for women, you see a very different picture. The spectrum of colors that you see on in the map on the left for black women looks basically the same, if at all greener than the spectrum of colors than the map you see on the right for white women. And so, what that shows you is that there's an important interaction or intersectionality, to use the term from sociology, between race and gender. Racial disparities in economic mobility in the US are driven in particular by differences between the prospects of black men and white men, not black women and white women, who seem to have much more similar rates of mobility. So why exactly is that? People are still trying to figure that out. It might make you think about things related to the criminal justice system or forms of discrimination that affect black men in the labor market in particular, et cetera. Whatever the answer is, it does suggest that understanding gender in the context of race is extremely important. So I've shown you here, I think that race is an extremely important part of what's going on, but I also want to emphasize that even conditional on race, if you look at the map for white women on the right, for example, there's still an enormous amount of variation in kids' prospects in different parts of the country. So race matters, but clearly place seems to play a role as well. So to go further, what we did next is, if you think about your local community, your neighborhood influencing how you do when you grow up, most people intuitively, or people in sociology, would not think of your neighborhood as like the Boston metro area, would be something much more granular, the school district you're in, the particular town you live in, etc. So what we did next is zoomed in to look at the data at a much finer geographic level. And to show you that data, I'm going to toggle over to a website. Let me just see if I can get this to work here. Yep. Okay, so I'm going to toggle over to this website, the Opportunity Atlas. And give me 1 second. For some reason, I'm not seeing this. Yeah, here we go. So what we're starting out with here is the same national view that I've been showing you, the same statistics on upward mobility for the US as a whole. But the way this website works is that we can enter in any particular place that we want. So I'm going to type in Dartmouth, because of where we are, and we're going to zoom in and look at the data now at a census tract level. So neighborhood by neighborhood here in the Dartmouth, New Hampshire region. So census tracts are areas that contain about 4,000 people each. The US has 72,000 census tracts. And what we're doing is constructing the exact same set of statistics that I've been showing you at the national level, but now, at this more fine neighborhood level. So you're all more familiar with this area than I am, but the simple point that I want to make is the areas immediately around the Dartmouth campus, shown by that dot right there, have quite high rates of upward mobility, some of the highest in the US. But interestingly, like in many parts of the United States, you can go just a few miles down, right? So to this area here called Claremont, New Hampshire, for example, where you can see that kids' chances of rising up there are among the worst in the United States. And so this is common in terms of what we see across America, where often you can go a few miles down the road, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So that simple observation, I think, is useful, again, in understanding what might be going on. It suggests that the key drivers of these differences in economic opportunity are not about federal policies or state-level policies or broad differences in labor markets. No, it's about something much more local, hyper-local differences in the types of opportunities that kids seem to have. So to give you another example of that, we show you a snapshot here from New York City, and I'm just going to enter in an address in Brooklyn, where you can similarly look at the data there. Just give it a second to load with the internet. And so, once again, you can see in New York City, there's an enormous amount of variation in kids' chances of rising up across nearby areas. And it turns out, in New York, if I can zoom in here specifically, I'm going to cut the data to black kids, because we saw there were lots of differences by race. You might notice a bunch of the map disappears and turns gray. Why is that? Because there are no black people in many parts of New York. That's the incredible racial segregation of US cities. And so this is just showing you the data where you do actually have black kids. And so this particular address that I've entered, 530 Sutter Avenue, is one of the largest public housing projects in New York called the Van Dyke Public Houses. And the reason I've focused on that particular address is it turns out when we put out this data publicly, National Public Radio did some interesting investigative reporting trying to understand why north of this street called Dumont Avenue in the Brownsville area in New York, you seem to have very poor outcomes, like you can see in the Van Dyke houses, kids growing up in low-income families on average are earning only $18,000 a year. But if you come just across the street, just south of the street called Dumont Avenue, that number jumps up to something like $26,000 or $29,000 a year. So they tried to understand, what is it that's so different on the north side of the street versus the south side of the street. And so turns out south of Van Dyke Avenue is a place called the Nehemiah Houses, which is a mixed-income housing development that a congregation created in the 1980s. And they argued that growing up in that mixed-income housing development where you were exposed to different kinds of kids and had a quieter environment with a different context really made a difference in kids' lives. So motivated by that kind of reasoning, what we did next is tried to understand a little bit more the mechanics of how these differences across places were emerging, and in particular, try to test whether there's really a causal effect of growing up in, say, the Nehemiah houses versus the Van Dyke houses, or is it just that you have different types of people living in these different places? This is an age-old question in the social sciences. Does environment, do neighborhoods have a causal effect on kids' outcomes, or is it just about selection or sorting? So to give you a flavor for how we do that, let me go back to the slides here and talk through this example. I'm going to describe results from a study where we look at 5 million children that move across neighborhoods. And rather than getting into the statistical details of that study here, I'm going to summarize what we find with a simple example. So let's imagine a set of kids who move from the Van Dyke houses, which, as we saw in the Opportunity Atlas data, had very poor outcomes for kids who grew up there, to the Nehemiah houses, where we saw that kids who grew up from birth there tend to have much better outcomes. So what I'd like you to do is think about a set of kids who move between these two places at different ages, starting with children who move when they're exactly 2 years old, okay? So what we're gonna do is take a set of kids who make this move when they're exactly 2, track them forward 30 years using the tax records, and ask how much are they making as adults. And it turns out the answer to that is, on average, they're making about $25,000 a year. Okay, so that's for the kids who move when they're exactly 2. Now let's repeat that analysis, looking at kids who move when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on. And what you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make that move from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses, or more generally, from a red-orange colored parts of the maps that I've been showing you to a blue-green colored part, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat and you get no gain at all. So what do you see from this chart? I think there are 3 key takeaways. The first is that indeed it does seem to matter where you grow up. It's not just that different people live in different places. Neighborhoods actually do have a causal effect on kids' long-term outcomes. And for the people in the literature here, this of course relies on certain identification assumptions, and I'm happy to discuss that in more detail, but basically comparing kids who move at different ages, it looks like there's a real causal effect in terms of meaningful change in life outcomes from growing up in these different areas. And I view that as a really encouraging result, right? Because it suggests that the solution to these kinds of problems doesn't require looking back to the 1950s or to a different country. It's often 2 miles down the road in the same city, which suggests that you would think we would be able to figure this out and make progress going forward. Second, what you see is what seems to matter is childhood environment rather than where you're living as an adult. We see in this and many other studies that if you help people locate in a different environment, move to a different neighborhood, in young adulthood or later in adulthood, it has basically no impact on their economic outcomes. And finally, you see that there's sort of a dosage effect. Every extra year that you spend growing up in a better environment improves your long-term outcomes. So this is, I think, very important in the context of current policy discussions about early childhood intervention. So lots of people think about programs like Head Start, early childhood interventions, which we think can be incredibly valuable. But what we see in these sorts of data is moving to a better environment when you're 10 instead of 15 or 15 instead of 20 is still quite valuable. It's not like everything has been determined, after the very earliest years. So that finding, established in the US data, has since been replicated in many, many other contexts using different research designs, experimental designs, different design using public housing demolitions by an economist named Eric Chin in different countries and so forth. I won't describe the details of all this, but I think there's now a clear consensus in the social sciences. It's very nice to see with these kinds of data, we start to see real regularities in the data where we feel like we really understand how these things work. And so in a nutshell, it really looks like environments, local neighborhood environments have very large causal effects on kids' long-term outcomes in relation to childhood exposure. Okay, so having established that, a natural next question that you're probably wondering about is, okay, you've shown, some parts of New York have better outcomes than other parts of New York. This is true in the Dartmouth area, et cetera. So what is it that's actually different? What are these places that are producing more economic opportunity, producing more upward mobility? What are they doing differently? So that brings us close to the frontier of where this field is. What I'm going to do in the interest of time is summarize what we and many, many other researchers have identified in a series of papers using this publicly available Opportunity Atlas data as the strongest predictors of these differences in economic mobility across places. So here are the 4 strongest patterns we find. First, places that have lower poverty rates, that are more mixed income, like that mixed income congregation that I was describing in New York, they tend to be places with higher levels of upward mobility. Second, places with more stable family structures, more 2-parent families in particular, tend to have higher rates of upward mobility. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools, both at the K through 12 level and access to higher education, tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. And finally, places with greater social capital, that is, strength of the community, the nature of the networks. This is an age-old idea in the social sciences. These kinds of places tend to have higher levels of upward mobility. Now, one could give a talk on each of these different aspects at great length. I'm going to spend a little bit more time focusing on that last dimension of social capital, both because I think it's particularly important and because it happens to be the latest set of work that our team has done on these issues. So as I was saying a second ago, the idea of social capital and its potential importance for lots of outcomes has been discussed for more than a century in the social sciences, and there are folks like Bruce Sacerdote here at Dartmouth who've done great work on these kinds of questions. But measuring social capital has been challenging, particularly on scale. And so in our most recent work, we decided to try to tackle the measurement of social capital using a big data approach and think about its potential relevance for economic mobility by partnering with Meta, which operates various social network platforms, including Facebook. And so using that data, we first constructed this map here, which, again, let me describe how we construct and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So this is using entirely different data from the Facebook platform, using everyone who uses Facebook in the US between the ages of 25 and 44. That's about 72 million people, 84% of the US population in that age range, who between them have 21 billion friendships. Okay, so we take that data, classify everyone as being low income or high income using a machine learning algorithm, and we construct a very simple measure of what we call economic connectedness. We ask, what fraction of your friends are high income if you're a low income person? Blue-green colored places here are places where low income people have more high income friends. Red-orange colors are places where there's more disconnection by class. So if you look at this map, you probably recognize immediately that it looks incredibly similar to the maps of upward mobility that I've been showing you, constructed using completely separate tax record data. You can formalize that by doing a plot of the measures of upward mobility versus the share of high-income friends that low-income people have in the Facebook data. And you can see that indeed those two things are incredibly strongly correlated. Unlike the job growth scatter plot that I started out with, this is one of the strongest correlations that we or anybody else has identified with upward mobility and any determinant. Now, when you look at this plot, one interpretation of a place like San Francisco, which has very high economic connectedness and very high upward mobility, is that it is a causal effect of being connected to high-income people that you have high levels of upward mobility. And there are many mechanisms you can think of. Maybe when you're connected to higher-income folks, you get job referrals, internships. Maybe it shapes your aspirations. If you've never met anyone who goes to college, maybe you don't think about applying to college, etc. But there are also other explanations you can think about, other correlational explanations, where it could be that San Francisco, is a very rich place. Part of the reason that you have a lot of high-income friends if you're a low-income person in San Francisco is you're surrounded by higher-income people. That's going to mean that it's a place with higher resources, maybe more funding for schools, things like that. And maybe it's that fact that's leading to the higher levels of upward mobility rather than the social interaction itself. So to give you a sense of how we can start to distinguish between these kinds of possibilities, let me turn to this plot here, which is what I really see as the central result of this study. And I'll walk you through this in steps to show what I see as the key result. So what we're starting with is plotting for every zip code in America. Every dot here represents a different zip code in America. We're going to plot the share of high-income friends among low-income people, that Facebook measure of economic connectedness, against median household income in the zip code. Just a simple measure of how rich your zip code is. You can see that there's a pretty clear upward sloping relationship there. That makes sense intuitively. It just reflects the fact that if you live in a richer place, you tend to be friends with the people around you, so you're going to have richer friends on average on Facebook. So that's kind of mechanical. You'd kind of expect it to work that way. So now we get to the key point. Notice that there's still a lot of dispersion vertically in these dots. So in a given zip code, say zip codes where people are making $50,000 a year, there's some places where people have many more high-income friends, some people where they have many fewer high-income friends. So let's now color these dots by the rates of upward mobility from the Opportunity Atlas tax data. Remember, red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. Blue-green colors represent places with higher levels of upward mobility. What you see here, I think, is a very striking pattern, which is that if you take any vertical slice of this data, so you move up, so take a set of zip codes with incomes around $50,000 a year, and look at a set of zip codes where the poor are not interacting with the rich versus a set of zip codes where there is a lot of cross-class interaction. You can see the colors are changing systematically from red to blue as you move up on this chart, showing that holding fixed average incomes, changes in economic connectedness strongly predict upward mobility. But if you do the converse exercise and take any horizontal slice of this graph, so look at very low income areas versus very high income areas, holding fixed the level of social interaction in the Facebook data, there's basically no change in the colors as you go from left to right. There's no relationship with upward mobility. So what that seems to suggest, and various analyses built around this, which I won't go into detail in here, it's really the interaction measure rather than simple measures of income or poverty that are the key predictors of economic mobility, suggesting that it might really be the cross-class interaction, perhaps through the various mechanisms that I described earlier, that is key to driving economic mobility. Okay, so what I want to do in the next few minutes, having established that environment really seems to matter for kids' outcomes for a variety of different reasons, but importantly related to things like social connections. In the remaining time, what I want to do is take those insights from the research and talk about and show students in particular here how doing this kind of research can have a meaningful impact on policy and on people's lives going forward. And so I'm going to skip through a couple of details here and turn to, in the last 10 minutes or so, how we can take the research base and think about increasing upward mobility going forward. And I'm going to focus on 3 different areas for policy intervention that I think follow naturally from the set of research findings that I've just shown you. So in a nutshell, to summarize what I think we've learned from the research, if you think about the determinants of economic opportunity, it's the local environment that you grow up in from something like birth to age 22 or 23 that affects your long-term trajectory. So if you have that view of the world, I think you'd naturally think about 3 different ways to increase upward mobility going forward. First, you might think about reducing segregation. If I know that there's a place 2 miles down the road where kids have better chances of rising up, well, why don't I just help more low-income families move to those kinds of places? So that's one thing we can think about. Second, recognizing that not everyone wants to move, and you can't possibly move everyone anyway, we need to think about how we might bring opportunity to people where they currently are rather than bringing people to opportunity. How can you make place-based investments to turn those red-colored areas into blue-green colored areas? Finally, after age 18, the key touch point for most children is not the house they're growing up in, but the institution of higher education that they're attending. And I think there's a lot that we can do in institutions like this and many others to amplify the impacts of our higher education system on economic mobility. So let me spend a few minutes on each of these different areas in turn. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach. So to give you a sense of the state of policy in that space, let me show you a different snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas, this time from Seattle, where our team is doing some work. So you see that familiar checkered pattern where in Seattle, there are some neighborhoods where kids have great chances of rising up, other neighborhoods not so much. What we've done here in the bright green dots is overlaid the most common tracks where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. It's a bit of institutional context. In the US, we spend about $45 billion per year on affordable housing, the largest component of which goes to housing choice vouchers, which is basically rental assistance to about 2.5 million families to give them assistance to find housing in a more stable place, in a better neighborhood, hopefully to break the cycle of poverty. In Seattle, those vouchers are worth about $1,500 a month, okay? So if you look at where those dots are concentrated, you might notice a puzzling pattern. Even though you're getting $1,500 a month from the government, those dots are still concentrated in the red and orange colored parts of Seattle, not the blue-green colored parts, where we know from the work that I just showed you, kids are going to have a much better chance of rising up out of poverty in the next generation. So when we put out this data, a number of housing authorities noticed this pattern, and they, contacted us and they said, why are we seeing this? Why is the program not actually helping people access better neighborhoods? Can we potentially change this going forward? And so out of that came a pilot study, a collaboration with the Seattle Housing Authority, that we're calling Creating Moves to Opportunity, which was designed as a randomized trial. So we took 1,000 families that came in to apply for housing vouchers through the standard process, and 500 of them got some additional services to move to high opportunity neighborhoods if they wanted to do so. So think of it as basically a brokerage kind of support where there was customized counseling saying, this kind of neighborhood could be a good match for you given your preferences and where your job is and so forth, connecting you with landlords, advocating for you with a landlord, explaining why you'd be a good tenant, providing some support for application fees, security deposit, things like that. Basically trying to remove some of the barriers that might be preventing families from moving to high opportunity areas, even if they wanted to do so. So we ran this as a randomized trial, the idea being to see if we provided a little bit of this additional assistance, would it make a difference in terms of where families choose to live? So here are the results, randomized trials. You can just compare what happened in the control group, which did not receive those additional services, where only 14% of families ended up moving to high opportunity areas, the blue-green colored areas as defined by the Opportunity Atlas data. Whereas in the treatment group, as you can see here, that number jumps up to 54%, so more than half of the families are now moving to high opportunity places as a result of this relatively inexpensive intervention. Costs about $2,500 per family, which is not a small sum, but when compared with the total cost of the housing voucher, remember it's $1,500 a month, adds up to about $100,000 a family that we're already spending through this program. That's about a 2% increment in the program's expenditure. It's trivial in the grand scheme of things. But B, and I think maybe even more importantly, we estimate, based on our prior work, that the kids who by chance ended up in the treatment group rather than the control, they're going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes as a result of growing up in these different neighborhoods relative to kids in the control group. So enormously high rate of return to making that marginal investment. And so in light of those findings, that it looks like providing this additional social support in particular, and we ran a second round intervention where we tried to break up this intervention into different pieces, and we show that just giving people information about these areas, for example, doesn't do anything. It's really about providing this customized assistance in the search process, giving you a helping hand in finding housing. That really changes where people end up living. Based on those sorts of findings, just to show the students in particular here how this kind of work can ultimately have an impact. So when we put that work out, a number of people noticed across the country and in Congress in particular, and so then there was a bill passed with bipartisan support in Congress, authorizing $80 million of funding to replicate what we did in Seattle in 9 other cities across America. So that is currently happening. And so we'll see what that produces. Can these outcomes that we generated in Seattle be replicated elsewhere in the US? But I think even more importantly and encouragingly, there's now another bill that's just been proposed, again with bipartisan sponsors, a Republican and Democratic senator, to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year. And if you just look at the language of this bill, you can see how research has a direct impact, even in these politically polarized times, on what happens in policy formulations. You can see they're calling for an additional 500,000 housing vouchers targeted at families with kids under age 6. So that's coming from that downward sloping dosage graph that I showed you, that it's the youngest kids who benefit most. with access to counseling and case management services. That's coming from the Seattle evidence that this seems really important. Focusing on engaging new landlords in the voucher program, given this and other related evidence that the connections to landlords are really critical. And so you can see how, going from the basic research on how neighborhoods matter to this pilot study to ultimately scaling up, if this goes into effect, and many people think it's plausible that it will, given the bipartisan sponsors, that'll have an impact on thousands of kids' lives across the country going forward. So let me more quickly give you just some examples in these other two domains. I don't want to leave the impression that the moving to opportunity approach is the only way to tackle these problems. So on the place-based investment side, so how do you bring opportunity to people rather than helping people move to different areas? So here it's really key to think about what kinds of investments you can make in a particular place. I'm going to give you one example here. There are lots of different possibilities, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what works best. But again, to give you a flavor of how this plays out in the policy arena and practical things one can do. So when we put out this study, one of the early studies that I was describing, and we showed that Charlotte ranked 50th out of the 50 American cities in terms of rates of upward mobility, they responded in a very interesting way. So in the local newspaper, they talk about how Charlotte's not really a land of opportunity, despite themselves thinking that it is a really rapidly growing city and so forth. In light of that, they then set up a task force and a commission to try to figure out what they could do to improve economic opportunity for their own natives. A bunch of things came out of that. I'll highlight one here, which is that Bank of America, which as I mentioned earlier is headquartered in Charlotte, they recognized that while they were bringing many jobs to the city, they weren't actually helping the local community. So they made a commitment to hire 1,000 kids who grew up in disadvantaged communities in Charlotte itself. But they recognized that there was a reason they weren't hiring those kids to begin with, because those kids didn't have the skills to get the jobs that they were hoping to hire for. So they teamed up with a group called Europe, which is a Boston-based nonprofit that provides job training. So it's a job training program where you get particular technical skills, like IT skills, for example, if that's what they're hiring for, plus additional mentoring and a network that connects you to a particular firm that's trying to hire you and so forth. And so this kind of program is incredibly effective. So here's some data from an earlier randomized trial that was done of this Europe job training program, where we're following people who got access to the program, shown in the green in the treatment group, and by flip of a coin with a randomized experiment, in the orange, people who did not get access to the program. And tracking their outcomes over time using tax records, you can see that people who got access to the Europe program are earning about 35% more for many, many years afterward, showing that a job training program targeted at a pretty disadvantaged population can have really sustained impacts in the long run. And so that's one example of how you identify there's a problem in this set of neighborhoods in a given city, in Charlotte in this case, team up in the right way to bring this program to those kids. And I think that is one of many potential tools to try to bring opportunity to particular places. Again, I think something that will have considerable policy scale impact going forward. Finally, especially given where we are today, I want to end by talking about what higher education institutions can do to increase economic mobility. So just like we've put out data on upward mobility for every city, for every neighborhood in America, similarly, we've put out data on economic mobility for every college in the United States, how much every college is contributing to economic mobility. So in thinking about colleges' contribution to economic mobility, I think about two different dimensions. Let me start with the vertical dimension here, which I'm going to call the upward mobility rate. So here we're asking, if you're a low-income student who, say, attends Dartmouth, so you come from a family in the bottom fifth of the national income distribution, what is your chance of reaching the top fifth of the income distribution? Again, using information from tax records, this time linked to Department of Education data, gives us information on college attendance for everyone in the US. So you can see at Dartmouth or other similar places, Yale, Harvard, etc., kids who come from low-income families have excellent chances of reaching the upper middle class or beyond. So 50%, 60% are reaching the top fifth of the income distribution, conditional on starting in the bottom fifth. So it's really an impressive rate of upward mobility. But if you think about what a college contributes to economic mobility, it depends not just on how well those students do, but how many of those low-income students you have on campus to begin with. And on that dimension, you look at places like Dartmouth, Harvard, et cetera, less than 3% of kids at these campuses come from low-income, bottom 20% families. I'll give you another statistic. At Dartmouth, at Harvard, you're about 80 times more likely to be on this campus if you're from the top 1% of the income distribution, families making more than $600,000 a year, than if you're from a family in the bottom fifth of the income distribution. So these universities are incredibly skewed to the rich. And as a result, they obviously cannot be contributing a whole lot to economic mobility, because if you don't have a lot of low-income kids, you can't be creating a lot of upward mobility. Now, every dot here represents a different college in America. So you can see that on the other end of the spectrum, we have a whole bunch of colleges that are serving many, many low-income kids. But those colleges, as you can see, they don't have very high rates of upward mobility. So the kids who go to those colleges, they don't have great outcomes after college. And so what we have, I think, in the higher education system in the US is basically a problem where there are no dots essentially in the upper right side of this graph. You have very few colleges that serve a lot of low-income kids and actually have very good outcomes after colleges. So how do you solve that problem? I think there are really, if you look at this visual, there are two things you need to do. First, you want to try to figure out how to move the dots that are on the on the high end of this graph to the right. How do you expand access at places like Dartmouth? And second, how do you improve places like Tompkins Community College and many other two-year institutions across the US? So in thinking about this, particularly in this sort of context, people often wonder, is it possible to retain the very high academic standards of a place like Dartmouth or Harvard and expand access, or is it just that all these other disparities that we've talked about by age 18, the differences in schools and environment and so forth, maybe there just aren't that many qualified kids who can get into a place like Dartmouth from lower income families at that point. So I want to end with this figure here, which I think challenges that narrative and relates to some new work that we'll be putting out later this summer, where what we're doing here is using the SAT. We've linked in data on everyone's SAT scores in the US to the tax records, to give you a simple baseline measure of how kids are doing pre-college. Say you take all the kids who have an SAT score of exactly 1,500 and plot your chance of attending what I'm going to call an Ivy plus college, the Ivy League plus Stanford, MIT, et cetera, a couple other colleges, highly selective private colleges. So everybody here has the same SAT score. What is the chance that you attend, say, a place like Harvard or Dartmouth? You can see that if you even conditional on having the same SAT score are from the richest families in America, you are far more likely to attend one of these colleges than if you're from the middle class or the low end of the income distribution. So that suggests to me that it's not like everything is, baked by the time you're applying to college. There might actually be something these colleges could do to flatten this curve and perhaps contribute more to economic mobility. And that's something I hope we'll see in the years to come. So let me end by just coming back in a way to where I started. I've shown you a bunch of data for the United States. In particular, that's where our research team has focused. Looking around the audience, you can see there are lots of international students here as well. Of course, a lot of these issues matter, beyond the United States. And one of the things that's been interesting to see is other researchers taking the same sort of approach that we've been taking in the US and developing, similar methods in many, many other countries, assembling the data that's available there. And let me highlight, coming back to where I started with the contributions of folks at Dartmouth, to the map of India in the lower right here, which is constructed by your colleague Paul Novosad and collaborators, similarly measuring upward mobility in India using very creative methods and the terrific agenda they have there, assembling data to study these issues in developing countries. And I'll just end on a personal note. So my own parents come from low-income families in the southernmost tip of India in a state called Tamil Nadu. And I often wondered myself, how is it that I happen to have these opportunities and I'm standing here in front of you today? You can see that happens to be one of the highest upward mobility parts of India, and so it's been very interesting to see Paul and others' research in that personal context. So let me stop there, and thanks so much. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. We have an opportunity now to ask some questions of Dr. Chetty. So I'm going to give these microphones to two students who will take your questions. So please raise your hands.
Can I go? Okay, thank you very much, Professor Chetty. I have a question. One, is this data, like the identified tax data, available like for public use? One, two. Have people just curious. Two, have people ever moved to opportunity in the past? And I think yes, like because of great migration. But I'm also thinking of like when people who are lower income move to like middle income households, do we ever see existing middle income families move away? Like during like white flight when people move to like other places? And I'm curious about how that affects like income mobility.
Yeah, good question. So, you know, the individual level tax data certainly is not publicly available, and you know, you'd probably be happy to hear that your tax records are not freely available. But what we try to do is, you know, we and many other researchers now have access to those records internally through contracts with the U.S. Treasury and Census Bureau and secure environments where there's a bunch of privacy protocols and things like that. And then you can see, if you look at those websites there, we release lots of statistics from those data, because often what you care about is not one individual's records, but like on average what's happening in Dartmouth or in a different place, et cetera. And so being able to put that out publicly, all of that you can just look up very easily on these websites. That's useful for a lot of downstream research and policy analysis and so forth. On your second question on white flight or high income flight, you know, absolutely the folks here and elsewhere who've done work on these kinds of issues. So let me say one thing that I think is quite important empirically on that, which is I showed you that if low-income kids live in more mixed-income communities with more cross-class interaction, they do better. You can ask the converse question, do high-income kids do worse if they live in a place with more cross-class interaction? The answer to that is no. It is not a symmetric, zero-sum kind of game. And I think that's extremely important from a political point of view, because it suggests that you might actually be able to make progress with more integration without coming at the expense of hurting the rich.
Thanks, Professor Chetty. I want to ask a question for identification purposes. So, in your original graphs, you track children, right, at the age of 30, based on where their parents live. But how do you consider, you know, the children who might be in the lowest kind of lowest mobility areas? They might be forced to move away from those areas and move away from metropolitans where they're going to fundamentally earn less because those metropolitans are having a lot of job growth and people are raising house prices in those areas.
Yeah, so what your question gets at is the way we're thinking about location and all of this analysis. So whenever I refer to location in this talk, it was where you're growing up, not necessarily where you're living as an adult. And that's quite important, as your question picks up on. So in two different ways. So some of the places like in the middle of the country, like rural Iowa, which look like they have a lot of upward mobility, lots of those kids who are doing really well, they're not living in Iowa when we're measuring their incomes as adults. They're living in Chicago or in New York, et cetera. Conversely, a lot of the kids in urban areas, you know, some of the issue might be they are actually staying in very low opportunity places. We tend to see pretty low rates of migration, actually, for kids in low-income families, particularly in urban areas. And so, you know, more broadly, what I would say is where you're growing up, that human capital and social capital that you develop there, you seem to take that with you, and partly those experiences shape where you end up going. And that's completely distinct then from the labor market in which you end up. So I think it's very important to draw that distinction.
So I had a question about the slide where you have colleges, and you said one possible thing that you could change is you basically want schools like Dartmouth to be on the upper right-hand side. What is the kind of opportunities that schools like Dartmouth offer people are exclusive in the sense that if you increase access to colleges like Dartmouth, then those opportunities leave? So for example, if you have companies like Google and Microsoft hiring from Dartmouth strictly because it's exclusive, if you make it more accessible, can you be certain that this upward mobility rate remains the same?
It's a good question. I mean, so I think it's totally plausible that exclusivity or selectivity matters in terms of where companies want to recruit in terms of potential. So for instance, if we were to just have open access admissions and you had kids, say, with all different levels of SAT scores, grades, et cetera, clearly that would affect, a company's interest in recruiting on a campus. What I was trying to show you with this graph here is it seems feasible to me that you could end up having a more diverse population on campus without changing people's credentials, at least as measured in this one crude way, by their SAT scores. And we'll have more to say on that in some work we're doing at the moment. And so, if you take the view that selectivity based on latent kind of merit or potential to do work going forward is what matters, it seems to me that there's some capacity to have, just mechanically, you could have a more diverse class at the exact same distribution of SAT scores, holding fixed that notion of selectivity. Now, if on the other hand you have the view that companies just want to hire kids from rich families, which I think is less plausible, but if that's what's going on, then this kind of dimension to have more access that might mechanically reduce recruiting could become more of an issue. I suspect it's the former rather than the latter, though. So my sense is there's potential to make progress there, although one has to see what will happen.
Hi, Professor Chetty. Thank you so much for sharing. I thought this was really insightful, and I especially appreciated the graph about white Americans versus Black Americans and the income distribution across the country. I was wondering, did your team find any interesting patterns regarding other demographic variables,
Yes.
perhaps other races,
Yeah.
or religion, any other interesting patterns there? Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So I only didn't mention that in the interest of time, but you can look up on these websites Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, kids of immigrants, natives, etc. So to briefly summarize, if you look at Hispanic kids, if you look at the current generation, Hispanic and Black folks have the same levels of income roughly, like pretty high rates of poverty, relatively low levels of income. But there are very sharp differences in rates of upward mobility. Hispanic Americans have rates of upward mobility that are pretty close to white Americans. And so over the generations, our sense is that Hispanic folks, the disparity in their incomes relative to white Americans is going to narrow dramatically. Unlike for Black kids, because of these big differences in mobility, they're going to persist over time unless something fundamental changes on that dimension. For Asian kids, you find, again, an interesting pattern. So Asian kids, if you just look at the data directly, have the highest rates of upward mobility by far. Asian kids growing up in low-income families, have the highest incomes. And sometimes that's led in the literature to a discussion of a model minority and what's going on there and so forth. But my view is that basically turns out to be mistaken, because it turns out if you subset to the set of Asian kids who have parents who were in the US, so not the immigrants, but kids of natives, their rates of mobility look exactly the same as white Americans. So Asian kids, I think, temporarily have higher rates of economic mobility, but in the next generation are just going to converge to looking like the white population.
Hi, I'm new to econ, so maybe I might be understanding this wrong, but I had a quick question on how cost of living comes into play in terms of upward mobility, because I was wondering the same level of income in one place is a much higher class than the same level of income in another place. So I guess I was wondering if the same level of income, and I guess in a more rural area, is looked at when compared to the same level of income in a big city, the amount of upward mobility is a lot less in that other place. How does that come into play?
Yeah, excellent question. And it's exactly the right question, I think, to be asking from an economic perspective. So let me answer that in two steps. So first, empirically, you can construct real measures of income adjusting for local costs of living, right? So you can get data on local rents, price of groceries, things like that, and construct a measure of income that adjusts for that, and then redo all the analysis that we've been showing. Turns out the map you get of upward mobility is correlated 0.9 with the map that I've been showing you, meaning it looks basically the same. So why is that the case conceptually? The way to think about it is that upward mobility is fundamentally about the difference between kids and parents' incomes, right? And so despite some of the examples I was giving earlier, particularly at the low end of the distribution, most kids tend to stay close to where they grew up. So the average kid in the US in their 30s lives about 17 miles away from their mom, okay? And so what that means is you're in the same cost of living area, basically. So take a place like New York, you're absolutely right that $40,000 goes less far in New York than in Iowa. So that pulls the kid down in the real income distribution. But it also pulls their parents down, who will tend to be from New York as well, in the income distribution. So if you think about upward mobility relative to your parents, it's basically unchanged by those cost of living adjustments. Up here.
Yes, thank you so much for coming in. I was just wondering on that, on a similar note, because your data is already highly correlated with race, do you think there's any value in considering affirmative action like policy dedicated towards geographical factors that you've gone over today?
Yeah, great question. I certainly think thinking about measures of neighborhood disadvantage and advantage, as the College Board has started to do in the context of college admissions, can make sense. More broadly, as this type of chart illustrates, I think thinking more carefully about the role of class in America in college admissions and many other dimensions is going to be increasingly important. And that's something on which I hope we'll be able to make progress in the years to come. Yeah, but absolutely, I think in addition to race and perhaps independent of race, thinking about dimensions of class as they correlate with neighborhoods and other factors is extremely important.
I see lots of other questions, maybe one hand over there, and that'll be our last question.
We have one at the front.
And one in the front as well. Yeah.
So I was wondering, so on your graph that you had about black women versus white women and black men versus white men, besides like criminalization, does like the higher amount of like college degrees help by like black women like introduce that like education factor into that wealth difference between them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. So you're exactly right that black women have very high levels of college attainment, even higher than white women, it turns out, once you control for parental income. And so that's part of why they end up having higher levels of income. The way we're thinking about it is, why is it that black women have high levels of college attendance, high levels of workforce participation, et cetera, but black men don't? Part of it could be about criminalization, part of it is about other factors that I think are limiting opportunities for black men in particular. But the way I look at that is kind of college is on the pathway to success for many people, and we need to step back and think both about why black men are not attending college and then what the root factors are that are leading to those differences to begin with.
Hi, Professor Chetty. Thanks so much for coming to talk to us. I think one of the big takeaways from your presentation is that using your data, there's a high amount of heterogeneity, even like 2 miles down the road with different neighborhoods and different outcomes. Given that, I was wondering what you think like the future of like policies are. Like, do you think the most effective thing is to extend these RCTs that we've run to give these more personalized, I guess like aid for economic mobility, or is there still room for like state level or federal level policies that can be effective?
Yeah, it's a great question, and gets at, I think methodologically the frontier of our field. Relates to things like the Dartmouth Atlas in the context of health issues and so on. I mean, what I take from all of this kind of work is disaggregation is incredibly valuable. So, 30, 40 years ago, and even more recently in economics, I think there's been a tendency to kind of find one-size-fits-all kind of solutions. We've had very limited data generally, and so, what can we do that can improve opportunity or improve health, et cetera, in a fairly uniform way? And what we're starting to see is what the issues are in one community or in one place might be very different from another place. And so I think that kind of detailed diagnostic analysis can be very valuable. Now, what does that mean for policy? At some level, local policy intervention can be very valuable, but often the architecture is set at the federal level. So take something like the housing voucher example I was giving you. Local housing authorities can do, and I think will do a lot more to make their programs more effective. But at the end of the day, the appropriations for the housing voucher program to begin with are set at the federal level. And so how that program is designed at the federal level, how much funding it has, what its parameters are incredibly important. And then I think it's also very important to think about how you intervene at the local level to make those programs effective. And I think one of the messages I hope you'll take away from this talk is this kind of new data, these new methods that we have in our field can help us make progress on connecting those things and understanding where the issues are much more precisely than was previously feasible.
I know we have probably many, many other questions that we'd like to ask. Unfortunately, Dr. Chetty does have dinner to go to. Thank you all very much for attending. Thank you very much for your time.